Welcome to GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises, the program where we dig deep into the original meaning of Revelation, but particularly looking forward to an intergenerational view of what Revelation can mean for us today. What surprises can Revelation bring to us in today's world? And joining me today are several of my colleagues that have been on this program many times before. And we have Guilherme.
Yes, I'm Guilherme Borda. I am a PhD student at Andrews University.
And then there's Shifra.
Hi, I work with Gen Zs and Millennials and the Women's Ministry of Campus Hill Church in Loma Linda.
All right, and then there's Nick.
Yes, I work with the younger Gen Zs, the teenagers at the Azure Hills Church in Grand Terrace, California.
Awesome. When we left off, we were in Revelation 12:17, where it says that the dragon was angry with the woman and went away to make war with the remnant of her seed. And as we were closing last time, we were talking about the remnant, and notice that in the Old Testament, the remnant concept appears at least three different ways. First of all, there's a historical remnant. When you look back in history, you can see a group of people, they have a name, they can be counted, they can be identified, you can tell their story. All right, so the historical remnant is an identifiable group of people. The faithful remnant, on the other hand, are those within that historical remnant that retains the message and the mission and so on of the original group. The group celebrates what God has done in the past, but not all the people are necessarily faithful to God's original mission. And then there's finally the eschatological remnant, which goes way beyond the historical remnant and opens up to the whole world in a universal, dramatic, surprising way. That's the pattern throughout the Old Testament. So historical remnants, there are many of them. For example, the Jews today would be a historical remnant of what God was doing back in the time of the Exodus. So even, whether or not any particular congregation of Jews is faithful to that original mission, their very existence reminds the world of the Sabbath and the laws of God and the Old Testament and so on. Tremendous contributions. Then Roman Catholic Church, for example, regardless of whether you consider it faithful or not, the Roman Catholic Church is a historical entity that can point its way all the way back to the disciples of Jesus. And so whether or not that entity is faithful, it is reminding the world of the New Testament, reminding the world of Jesus and the cross and things like that by its very existence. More people know about those things through the existence of Christian churches like that than any other way. And then Lutheran Church, for example, points back to Martin Luther and what God was doing during the Reformation. So the question is there a historical remnant for Revelation 12:17? It's an end-time church or an end-time body. Chapter 12 goes all the way back to the time of Jesus and his disciples. It goes through the hardships of the Middle Ages and so on. When you get to the end of time, there's this remnant of the woman's seed. The woman represented all of Christian faith, all the way back to Jesus and perhaps also Israel before that. But now the woman slips off the scene. And now you have a remnant. And that remnant believes certain things. So the question is, who would that remnant be historically? And remember, historical remnants aren't necessarily faithful to the original mission. There's nothing to brag about, nothing to boast about, that you're part of this institution that points back to what God did a long time ago. But it's important to understand, what is Revelation pointing to? And I'd like to share my screen here, something we haven't done before, I don't think. But let's just see if this will work and give you an idea of, all right, here we are. And I hope you don't mind the Loma Linda University. I stole this slide from a class that I'm teaching. It's the remnant of Revelation is associated with a number of ideas. First of all is the gospel. In Revelation chapter 10, the gospel is central to the message at the end of time. Also in Revelation 10, it points to the books of Daniel and Revelation being important in that message. So the gospel is the everlasting gospel. It's the same gospel that was taught by the apostles, but in an end time context, in the context of the books of Daniel and Revelation. There's also a message about the heavenly sanctuary in Revelation 11. There's a message about keeping all of God's commandments. And since most Christians acknowledge God's commandments, there must be something about that that's a little bit different. And we'll come back to that. In chapter 13, the remnant warns the world of end-time deceptions that are coming, Satan's final delusions. In chapter 14, the remnant is close to Jesus. And it has a message about the hour of God's judgment. And then that message is given in the language of the fourth commandment. So there's that final piece. The commandments of God are significant, but not all the commandments are consistently obeyed within the body of Christianity. And so the remnant would have a message particularly about the Sabbath. Now, colleagues here, when you look at that list, the collection of items, what comes to mind?
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
So first of all, emotionally, I'm mind blown. Then second, the faithful believer in me is like, is like, wow, like this really does sound similar. I'm blown away. I can see from Revelation 10 to 14 these descriptions of the remnant, the rest of the offspring in 12:17. And then the skeptical part of me is like, how do we know this isn't confirmation bias?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, anybody else got a comment about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating that we're talking about this today. And I know we don't typically want to probably date the show, but we're filming on October 22nd. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church has a name for this day that most people would probably not know about unless they're an Adventist. But today is typically referred to in our tribe as the Great Disappointment, October 22, 1844. And I was actually reading just this morning. It's a book called On This Day, I believe. It's a devotional book about special dates in Christian history. And it actually talked about the Millerite movement and how at the time there were a lot of revivals going on in the northeast of the United States and everything like that. And this man named William Miller was converted and he started studying the Bible. He was drawn to Daniel and Revelation and started preaching the day that Jesus was expected to return based on what he saw in the book of Daniel specifically. And it was interesting that the title for the page was Disappointment. And at the end of the reading, of course, it says that they were disappointed. They were waiting in churches and in fields, and Jesus did not come on that date as expected. But it did say that there, just like you were saying, Dr. Paulien, it didn't use this word, but there was a remnant. There were people that came out of that disappointment and kind of persevered. A movement was started, the Adventist Church. So I just thought that was fascinating in light of what you've shared and what's on this list, because certainly out of that movement that kind of persevered, those that didn't fall away and just kind of give up on the whole thing after they were wrong about the date or what happened on the date, they persevered and they continued to preach Daniel and Revelation. They certainly had a great focus on the heavenly sanctuary, that Jesus made a move in there rather than coming to the earth at the end of the 2300 days. Certainly they preached the Sabbath commandment, all of God's commandments, started warning of end times, all these things. So just fascinating the way this list lines up with what today means for Seventh-day Adventists.
Well, and here's the thing, those early Adventist pioneers came to the conviction that the Seventh-day Adventist denomination was the remnant of Revelation. And you'll even hear language like remnant church, even though the word church is never associated with remnant directly in the book of Revelation. So Shifra is this confirmation bias, you see. And I would suggest one thing, and that is that the Adventist pioneers were not a church when they came to these conclusions. They were studying the book of Revelation. They found in Revelation 10 evidence that in the very last period of Earth's history, God would raise up a people teaching these things. And they looked around the world around them, they said nobody was doing that. So they said, well, if no one's doing that, then we need to do that. And so it was this package of ideas that coalesced the movement, and that movement became then the Seventh-day Adventist Church a number of years later. So there isn't confirmation bias, I guess, in the sense that, well, because you're an Adventist, you're going to read it all back into Revelation. Is that what you were saying?
Something like that.
Yeah, yeah. So that's not what happened historically. Now, for me personally, I've been studying Revelation 10 to 14 for many, many years, and I never quite noticed this. I was just studying these passages and saying, you know, what's going on in Revelation 10? It's a very tough passage. And as our viewers may know, you know, looking back on previous programs, to see it pointing to the book of Daniel, pointing to the book of Revelation was new for me. And to see that so clearly pointed out in the text, all of these 8 things that I have here are exegetically compelling. And that's the difference. You know, confirmation bias, you kind of have a squishy relationship sometimes. But I saw these exegetically before I ever saw as a package. Whoa. Then that's why our Adventist pioneers thought that they were the remnant, because this is what Revelation is teaching. So that's sort of the combination there. But Guilherme, do you have a reaction to this?
Well, my reaction actually is that what strikes me as interesting is that when you look at this list, it also seems that, you know, like you look at New Testament theology, the theology of the different books in the New Testament, an argument could be made, well, definitely from a Seventh-day Adventist perspective, but an argument could be made that those are precisely the things that the New Testament teaches. Well, of course, there's the emphasis on then Revelation could be discussed, but we could say an emphasis on eschatology, definitely, right? I think even, I think New Testament scholars in general would agree that at least in many of the books, or at least for a significant portion, or in the early decades of the movement, the Christian movement was very much eschatological and apocalyptic, right? And then you have, of course, with the book of Hebrews, the emphasis with the heavenly sanctuary. And then, well, the gospel, of course. Now, keeping all of God's commandments, then, of course, this would be debatable, right? People have different agreements. Warning of end-time deception is very clear in Pauline literature. And so I would say that it could be argued that if this is a mark of the remnant at a specific time in history, it is also because it is the teaching of the New Testament. What the next step would be that the remnant is one that ideally tries to be faithful to the scriptures to the best of their understanding, right? And so
I like the point you're making, that most of these are standard New Testament teaching. I think. And as such, then they would track with with everything that's going on elsewhere in the New Testament. But I think what the Adventist pioneers saw here is packaging it, first of all, with a certain period of history. Mm-hmm. This would come after Daniel's time prophecies. This would come toward the end of Earth's history. And that Daniel and Revelation would be critical to it. I don't think you get that elsewhere in the New Testament with the same kind of clarity. Sabbath, I think of a text like Mark 2:27, where Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man. I understand that to be was made for Adam, whose name means the man, And so Jesus is saying the Sabbath is universal. It's not just for the Jews. That's a very important piece. So you could make that case without Revelation. But this whole package focused in on the end of time, I think is a fairly solid one. And this is the foundation of Seventh-day Adventist understanding and teaching. But let's keep in mind, we're not saying that if you're a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, you're automatically in. We're not saying that that's something special that to brag about, etc. But no, that is simply a group of people who recognize that God has something going on at the end of time, and they wanted to be part of it. And that's special. And those Seventh-day Adventists who are faithful to that mission will be at the center of God's purpose moving forward to bring an end time eschatological remnant that will shock the daylights out of us. Now, let me take you there a step further.
Before you change gears, make sure that I heard you all scholars correctly. So I think I'm getting it. I think I'm tracking. So you address the confirmation bias because these things are there in the text. When you do the exegesis of the text, they're there, and then it just happens to also be in line with this idea of the Seventh-day Adventist movement, not even a church, movement from our early pioneers, focus and study. Now, when it comes to I really like where you're going, Guilherme, because it was touching what I felt was a gap for me. How does this list of remnant of Revelation tie in textually to Revelation 12:17? Currently, my answer is those who keep the commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus are the ones that the dragon makes war with. Help me tie that tighter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that the concept of remnant is one of several names for God's last day movement. Seventh-day Adventists kind of fixed on the remnant idea as a moniker that was particularly meaningful to them. But in chapter 14, the same group is 144,000. And later in 14, they're called the saints. And in chapter 7, the 144,000 is called the great multitude. And so on. You have a number of names. The question is there one people at the end of time? Is there one message at the end of time? And if your answer is yes, then remnant, 144,000, all of those is the same people. And that's how I'm looking at it. As I do exegesis of Revelation, I think the interchangeability of these names is clear. And it goes on the other side of it too. If you go to chapter 17, you see the enemy powers named by many names as well, but they're interlaced within the text. It's not like you got a dozen different opponents. You have one opponent with a dozen different names. So I like your question. I think the key thing here is the message of Revelation was there. The early Millerites studied that book and found in it a package of ideas that gave meaning and purpose to what they had experienced. And that's what Seventh-day Adventists celebrate, that back in the 19th century, God did something dramatic and called the world's attention to this package of ideas. Now, one more thing. Why would this be important? Why should anybody care? And this is the exciting part here. Is this confirmation bias? Once again, I don't think so, because I had done the revelation work already before I did this work in world religions. But I was asking the question a few years back, what is right about each of these religions? You know, often I think Christians, we say, what's wrong with Judaism? What's wrong with Islam? You know, we go about, you know, what's wrong with Hinduism, etc. And I said, why can't we just ask the question, what's right? You know, if the Holy Spirit is everywhere, what's God doing there? And as I asked that question of Christianity, I came to the conclusion that the core values of Christianity are gospel, grace, and Jesus. Neither Judaism nor Islam has a message associated with that package of ideas. Jesus is a prophet within Islam, but does not play the kind of role that the gospel has for him. For Judaism, then, law, obedience, and Sabbath are three things that jump out as core to what Judaism is all about. And then I asked the same question of Muslim scholars, what's the center of Islam? And you have answers like submission, judgment, eschatology. And I've shared these things, these core values, in settings where you had 1/3 Jews, 1/3 Muslims, 1/3 Christians, and nobody was saying, no, that doesn't represent us. And the interesting thing about it is that each of these is rejected by the others. Generally, Jews' core values are rejected by Christians and Muslims. Christianity and Judaism generally rejected by Muslims. Christianity generally rejects these others. And here's where it got excited for me one day.
I'm already excited.
What I had learned about Revelation and what I had learned about world religions came together for me one day. And that was the realization that all of these core values are attributed to the remnant of the book of Revelation. Now, if that is true, then it means this message of the remnant, this message of Revelation 12:17 is maybe as important as any other biblical message for our time. This is God's prophetic surprise, all right? That God foresaw the world we're in today, a world where reconciliation between the religions is the greatest need.
Wow.
You September 11, rioting in the Middle East, battles in Europe, between Muslims and Christians and so on, the wars between Israel and the Palestinians. Finding some reconciliation between religions is the greatest need of the world today. And God had a message in the book of Revelation that could connect with all of them. That's the part that blew me away. What do you guys think?
I think this is fascinating. And then, thinking about the whole confirmation bias thing, regardless of if you call yourself a Seventh-day Adventist or not, these are the things, that previous slide, that make up the remnant of Revelation, what it's talking about. And so I don't see it as confirmation bias either. I see it as, hey, this is what the New Testament teaches. This is what we find from the Old Testament as we pull all these things together. And I don't see it as confirmation bias, reading yourself into the story. I see it as disciples of Jesus. I see it as an invitation. Like, if you're reading the scriptures, throughout Revelation, there's this whole idea of, it kind of polarizes, right? It's like God's people, not God's people. And it's inviting you constantly to make a choice. Like, it's inviting you to be a part of the remnant. And so, of course, as Adventists, we'd love to invite everyone to be Adventists, but whether or not you use that title, we're all invited to live with a focus on these things that you've just presented. And I have the senior pastor at my church actually just recently came out with this book deep calling, and I'm doing a book club with some other pastors, and there's this one paragraph called The Remnant. It has a subtitle, and I'd like to read it for you. It kind of talks about this invitation a little bit, if you don't mind. One paragraph says, Seventh-day Adventists believe in a faithful group of followers who are on earth at the close of history. What characteristics mark this remnant? The remnant are a people called out for the sake of the world, not an organization unto themselves, but a people faithful to God, in order to draw other people into faithfulness to God. Blessed with a precious relationship with God so that they can be a blessing to others, inviting them into relationship. According to Revelation, these people keep the commandments, they live in the way God designed, and have a testimony or experience with Jesus themselves. The people described are disciples, following after Jesus and living the way he lived, while experiencing Jesus and sharing their testimony of that experience. This is discipleship. This is the call of the remnant. So it's an invitation. It's not confirmation bias. It's an invitation from the book of Revelation to live as disciples of Jesus in every area of our life. And I believe every area you've brought up today.
We've got a couple of minutes left. Let me just say quickly, for me, I'm director of the Center for Understanding World Religions and a professor of New Testament. The two studies that I bring together here, I did independently without any thought of linking the two together. And it was just one day as I was staring at this chart of the three religions, and I just said, wait a minute. Every one of those items is in the book of Revelation for the remnant. And that would mean that God has a unique and special purpose for this package of ideas. Does that make Seventh-day Adventists better than anyone else? No. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is flawed, just like every other remnant has ever been. Historical remnant has its flaws. It's a mixed bag of faithful and unfaithful. But it's the message that the Adventist pioneers recognized that's the key. It's the mission that's exciting. Anyone have a last word before we close?
One thing I would like to say is, also in my study with Revelation, I came across an idea that I think is similar, that I would like to leave as like a reflection. As we look at the book of Revelation and we see things that are appealing, and we should seek to be like that, right? So you said that Adventist pioneers, they sought to be like that. The idea, you have these exemplars in the narrative, and we should seek to be like it. And the interesting thing that happens is that the symbol influences the referent. The symbols influences the very people it points to and represents. So something that we can unpack later, but something that I have thought during my studies that I think ties to that. Let's try to be like those exemplary symbols.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we come to the end of our time here. Once again, we have found that the book of Revelation, carefully examined, can bring prophetic surprises. We hope you enjoyed these prophetic surprises today, and we'll see you again next time.